yeah, just be mindful this time of year as the weather really shifted. It was officially fall yesterday. That if you have seasonal allergies, they're going to kick in with this. So plan around that with your exam coming too. I know I realized I was like, oh, sometimes those symptoms can be similar to COVID symptoms. So just if you're feeling crummy, kind of isolate yourself just so you know that it's allergy symptoms and not COVID symptoms. So yeah, yesterday I was like by myself, and then I felt better by last night, so I was glad. I was like, okay, allergies. You know if you get allergies, just remind yourself. I know we get a little more worried if you get any of those kind of runny nose, feeling run down kind of symptoms, maybe sore throat, scratchy throat. They probably are allergies, and especially with your class passes, just kind of if you get seasonal allergies, I would say no, that your symptoms haven't changed because you get seasonal allergies. If you say, yes, my symptoms have changed, you're going to be put in quarantine. So just be mindful of if you have allergies. Put that in the back of your mind to file that you have normal symptoms for this time of year, and then just kind of self-monitor. I don't want you guys to be so honest that you're like kicking yourself out of class. So be careful with that. Okay, so let's get to lecture. We finished off talking about speciation. So let's take a look at this question. Fruit fly species all more alike, all look alike, all look more or less alike. If you have a male and a female fruit fly, how can you prove they're the same species? This is a really good question that might be similar to a question you will find on your exam. This is really important to know how to prove that you have individuals who are of the same species. So give these a read over. All right, what do you think is the correct answer? Yeah, D. Really important to know that if you are going to prove that two individuals are of the same species, they not only have to mate successfully, but it is very important, based on what we studied in speciation on Tuesday, that you can also show that they have offspring who are viable, who are fertile, and who can have offspring to bring them to the next generation. Because a very important part of evolution is not only mating, but that your offspring are fertile and can make the next generation to keep your population going. So, star. I put these questions in there for a reason. They're practice and usually have good concepts in them. So this is a really important concept to realize. Okay, so how do we get new species then? If we talk about all of the ways that we have mechanisms for not making new species, but how do we get new species? So let's take a look at this idea of what we call speciation. We've been kind of looking at anti-speciation up to this point, but how do we get new species if we have all of these barriers in the way? So there are things that can happen over time to give you new species. So one of the things about this, in terms of, yes, mutations can happen. And looking at Hardy-Weinberg in terms of from one generation to the next, one of the things to remember about Hardy-Weinberg is that while we can see alleles changes or frequencies over time to show that we do have the species evolving, is it going to, if we're looking at, let's say, that we have P, our dominant allele, is 60% of the population, and Q, our recessive allele, is 40% of the population. Do you think from one generation to the next, this is going to change? Okay, so let's think about how quick evolution is going to happen. So this number, while we're only working to maybe, like in this case, 1 decimal place, there's a lot that's behind here. So let's say this number is so let's say that these are the numbers. What likely is happening from one generation to the next, that if, let's say, the recessive trait in the current environment is more favored than the dominant trait, or the recessive allele is more favored than the dominant allele, that from one generation to the next, so in this generation, this is what we have. So in our next generation, let's say that this changes to 0.2. Does it change the overall allele frequency in terms of what percentage we're seeing? But did the allele frequency change? Okay, so while the allele frequency is changing, it's changing at really tiny increments. And so then let's say that in the next generation, we get that. And in the next generation, we get that. And we get that, and we get that, and we get that. And so that in 10 generations, we're going to finally get this changes to a 1. Okay, so now we're at 10 generations later. For all of these, so then in another 10 generations, this changes, right? Or this changes. So we're at 20 generations, and 30, and 40, and 50. So that eventually we're down to, it's going to take a lot of generations to change this number, and especially this number right here, right? So that's why evolution takes a really long time, because you're going to have these tiny little incremental changes. So that if we're looking at, and what you're looking at in lab, if we're looking at the P and Q from one generation to the next, these numbers from one generation to the next are not going to change. On rare occasions, maybe, but usually we're talking about teeny little incremental changes. While these incremental changes are small, they are significant. They're just not significant here. So we do get those changes over time, but they're really, really tiny. And so they take a long time to add up. So speciation, we might start getting those teeny little incremental changes in a species over time, but they don't add up to anything right away. And if 2 species are having those incremental changes where they are doing convergent evolution, where they're getting more similar, if you have 2 species that are like Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, if they were alive still, and we were both changing at these small increments over time, there is a very slight possibility that in many, 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 many generations, like thousands of generations later, that maybe we would evolve so much similarly that we could mate and have fertile offspring. So there's got to be a lot of chance things happening. And again, remember, the environment is influencing this. So if we're living at the same time and we're already the same genus but a different species, and we might be evolving similarly because the environment is favoring certain traits, that maybe over a long time that we do have the ability to mate together. And that's what we mean by speciation. It's when 2 species become similar over long periods of time, that they can successfully mate, meaning that they have offspring who are fertile, and then the offspring of those 2 species have offspring and create a new species. So a lot of very random. So this really depends on 2 processes: isolation and genetic divergence. So isolation means that you're isolated, right? You have no contact, there's no gene flow, You're not together, you're not mating together, you're not making your genes from your population flow into the other population. You're both experiencing the processes of natural selection separately, but again, because the environment is affecting you both are having changes to make the characteristics that are favored in the current environment better, right? So in your next population, you're both having that same pressure from the environment. And so there's a chance of becoming different if your population is much larger, but if you're smaller, there is a chance that you're both going to change very similarly. Genetic divergence, that diverging idea. So here is two main reasons why some groups that are isolated become one species. So we're going to look at two ideas or concepts in genetic divergence. The first one is called allopatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, there's some kind of geographical barrier, meaning that there's a mountain, there's a big river, something that the two groups cannot get to one another. Again, remember, they're both experiencing natural selection separately, but probably similarly. This is the most common kind of genetic divergence. So what happens here is that they are separated. There's no gene flow. So the idea is that you have one group and all of a sudden there is an earthquake and it makes this huge gulf between the two groups. Now they're separated. So if you have that happening, what might happen there is that, let's say that this was all one and there's an earthquake, and now, so same species all together, now there's some kind of geographical barrier, like an earthquake causes this big gully here to appear, and then let's say that all of your food sources are over here, and there's no food sources over here. So of the two populations, if we have population 1 and population 2, because before everybody had access to this food, now this group doesn't have access to the main food sources. So we've changed the environment based on having this happen, this earthquake happen. Because these guys have an easier time surviving, maybe this group, one of the characteristics that develops based on the environment is this group gets fatter because they got access to more food, because half of their population over there, they don't get the food. And so with more access, they just keep eating and eating and eating, and they get fatter over time. This group is just trying to get whatever, let's say there's like little grasses here that they can eat, which is far different in terms of all of the food that they have over here. So this group over time starts to get skinnier. So we have different traits that are favored, and of course there'll be other traits that are favored based on having this geographical barrier. Over time, before they were the same species, but over this long period of time, due to this that's happened in the earthquake, because now they're experiencing different environmental pressures based on this happening. Many, many generations later, what might happen is that, let's say that this starts getting shallower and shallower, and it takes like 10,000 years, and eventually this fills in, and they can come back together and have gene flow, what we might see is because of this maybe 10,000 year period of being separated and then coming back together, that when population 2 tries to mate again with population 1, we find that they don't have viable offspring anymore. And so we've had convergent evolution. They've been moving away from each other, and this has become a new species from the original. So that's one way we get speciation, or new species. So different environments now make for different environmental processes. And that separation gives us something new. The other thing that could be happening is that they have different mutations that are favored in their new environments. And if new mutations are favored, then again, we get more genes that become different in the two gene pools. So the big test, again, like we just had that question before, is you'd have to see when they mate, do they have viable offspring? And by that we mean that the offspring are fertile and can mate and have offspring. If they can no longer reproduce with each other, they're different species. So here we have a group that lives on an island, and this is like the founder effect, that you have a group that hops on a log. They're like, this log is cool. And then it starts moving. They think, oh, this is just land. And it starts moving, and it takes them to this other island. And they don't have any more logs to get back. So they start living their lives. And let's say that over here, it's beneficial to blend in with green. And over here, it's beneficial to blend in with brown, so that they start to develop different characteristics that are favored in the different environments. And then over time, if you tried to mate them over a long period of time, if they cannot mate, this has become a new species. So that's allopatric speciation. The other kind is sympatric speciation, not very common. No geographical barrier. They start to specialize in their own niche. So this is more like ecological isolation, where they live in the same area, but maybe things start to get crowded, there's more competition, and so then they decide, or they just start to each specialize in different areas of the same environment. They don't interact much anymore, because they just start doing different things. And over time, even though they live together in the same environment, they become different species. Big thing with evolution is less competition. One of the reasons why when we studied population ecology, we saw that J-shaped curve, that when you have not much competition, you can start to have a lot of growth, and then environmental resistance kicks in, and you could have that crash. And a lot of this is competition for limited resources. So we definitely have seen kind of an application of evolution in action. When we were talking about ecology, we just didn't name it evolution, right? That when you have that boom and bust, that bust is all about competition, when environmental resistance kicks in, and then you can get a really bad crash, or it could crash and you level off lower. You have a lower carrying capacity in your environment. So here, very much similar to when we talked about ecological isolation, they start to become ecologically isolated from one another by one group decides to focus on this kind of apple, the smaller apple, and this one focuses on the larger apple, and they just stop interacting with one another. And then, of course, we know mutation. So like I was talking about with the video, mutation can lead to genetic isolation. Plants are really wacky. If you ever go on to take a botany class, you're going to learn all kinds of crazy things and adaptations that plants have done to survive over time. So one of the things that plants have the ability to do is they can do and mate with members of their species that undergo mutations or issues that cause them to have not only it'd be really bad if you had, even I said the other day, just a little more protein can be very bad because it can produce protein, a little more DNA. A little more DNA can produce in the long run extra protein, and extra proteins can code for things that cause diseases. And so if you end up with a completely extra chromosome, you usually end up having a lot of issues as an individual, if not totally die off. Plants can have polyploid, which means that they can have offspring with a whole extra set of chromosomes and still survive. That's very unheard of. So let's say that you have a species that has a chromosome number of 100, so that when they make sperm, an egg, that those cells have 50 chromosomes each, that when they would come back together, ideally, you'd go back to your species number of 100. But what can happen is that when these cells divide, let's say that the sperm has an issue, it's called non-disjunction, where the chromosomes don't separate appropriately during the formation of the gametes or the sperm and the egg. And if non-disjunction occurs, you could end up having, let's say, 100 chromosomes, that the chromosome number doesn't half itself in the process of making the sperm. So let's say that this sperm fertilizes this egg, and you get a cell that has an extra 50 chromosomes in it. That surely in most species would just, that cell wouldn't divide, maybe past a few divisions. It would just die off. However, plants, this can survive. Usually, again, what happens is usually that polyploid species don't have the ability to reproduce themselves. So like what we talked about, making of the mule, can't reproduce itself, but it makes offspring. And so when plants have these polyploid situations, they can produce offspring, but also this might produce viable individuals. So it might do both situations, where it produces viable offspring and non-viable offspring, but these offspring at least live. One of the cases where this happens, where humans have benefited and we've taken advantage, is that with watermelon, that we get watermelons that produce watermelons with seeds, which are the gametes. The seeds are the offspring. So in a seed, you can get a watermelon with seeds, you can plant that seed and grow a watermelon plant. But they also produce seedless. And a lot of people like seedless watermelon, right? Because then you don't have to spit out the seeds. So we have those situations where this species can keep going, but also produce something that might be desirable to humans, but not a good thing for that species. So they can do both situations. So you're definitely going to look at seedless watermelon differently now. All right, so again, just side by side looking at allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation, that what you said, sorry, I said it right, allopatric and sympatric. So here with allopatric speciation, you have some kind of geographical barrier. It separates the two species. They both experience the processes of natural selection similarly, but there are different situations now because of this geographical barrier, and that if they come back over time, you find that they are reproductively isolated. They can no longer mate with one another. Sympatric speciation, they're in the same area, but competition gets high, so we have some kind of environmental resistance that kicks in, and they start to specialize in parts of their niche, and the niche is how they live their life and their environment, that over time they become two different species in the same environment. So let's take a look at this question. Since the Pleistocene Ice Age, a really long time ago, deserts have been gradually forming in the southwestern United States. As the original lakes and rivers of this area shrank from connected streams into isolated streams, fishes living in them developed a strong potential for... So you've just heard about a number of different kinds of vocab, right? We didn't talk about this. So one of the things with test taking is that if you're like, no, I don't know anything about this, you can cross that one off right away. So we're left to 4 different kinds of vocab. So which one applies to this situation? Good, A, speciation. Would this example that we just looked at be allopatric or sympatric speciation? Good. Okay, so allopatric, because we just talked about a barrier that has happened. So you might see on the exam 2 questions with 1 gives you a situation and 2 gives you which kind. All right, so a little bit about extinction. Extinction is the death of all members of a population. Some of the definitions will say after 50 years, they'll claim something is extinct. Because they just don't want to say, I haven't seen any of those this year. They must be extinct. Well, maybe they went underground for a year based on the conditions. So you can get into very specifics about many of these biology definitions have very specific definitions, even depending on the situation. If you looked in the textbook for biogeography, for example, in different sections, it kind of defines it differently based on what kind of biology you're talking about. So if you read my message, I know Haley had pointed out that a couple of the objectives were a little ambiguous. I did point out biogeography. It's one I missed going over in lecture. I sent you all that, and specifically the definition that applies to what we're talking about in evolution. And then also it said the 3 environmental factors that influence natural selection, and I called them the 4 postulates. So the 4 postulates are in those 3 factors. So just take a look at my message if you haven't. This is kind of a mind-blowing fact. 99% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. Is there a chance humans will go extinct? Oh yeah, there's a big chance. We're looking at it, I feel like we're really looking at it right now, right? Between climate change and diseases that are going around, there's a lot happening that's not very favorable to us smart humans. So it's just a natural part of evolution. With humans, you can see in areas where when humans are gone, nature takes over really, really quickly. So, for example, the Mayans, if you go down to Central America, the Mayan culture, they built all these amazing buildings. They're now people who go into paleontology, they start to look for characteristics where they might find or unearth these Mayan buildings. So like they might look at a hill and see on the top of that hill a lot of triangle structures, and they go, I bet there's a lot of buildings, because they used to build a lot of triangular buildings, go bigger to smaller, smaller, smaller up to top. And so that's one of the clues that they look at, and they go, let's look around in on this mountain in this area, because there's a lot of hills right there. When humans are gone, nature just comes in and takes over. So I know a lot of people will say, like, we got to save the earth. And I'm like, the earth will be fine. The earth will be here. The earth will be better. It's us. We have to be more concerned about saving us rather than the earth, because the earth will do much better, I think, without us. And then another thing that can influence extinction is one's interaction with other species around them. So I mentioned competition already, and then just going back to ecology, we know that other things that can influence the biotic potential, a part of what we called environmental resistance, as a reminder, were also things like predation or parasites, as well as space, which we just talked about. And the last one, humans. With humans, we have had the highest number of extinctions when we have existed in the history of life. And the reason that they can tell that is as paleontologists and archaeologists look into the ground, they can see more species were left behind. Less species left behind than they are now. We see a lot more extinction factors. And two of those main issues come with habitat destruction. We just get rid of the habitats of different species, and they don't have the ability to move to other places, or we don't help them move to other places, and then they're gone. So let's talk about some of the benefits of preserving biodiversity. So one is just ethical, right? Is it good